All right. Just before the Prime Minister begins, please note that if you want to opt out of the recording, feel free to message Elena from the ArtCom just to let her know that you do not want to be recorded. I also hope that in case any of you changes your mind, you can in fact approach the ArtCom post facto in order to get yourself redacted from this recording. Okay, having said that, Prime Minister.
Okay, can everyone hear me all right?
Yep.
Awesome. I'll take people on in chat. It'll take around 5 minutes. Cool. Is anybody not ready? We live in a world ruled by a labor aristocracy that free rides on the legacy of colonialism. I'm going to prove 3 things in this speech. 1, open borders create more economic efficiency, which enables labor mobility for people who otherwise would be trapped in poverty. 2nd, I'll prove that borders themselves create labor arbitrage that reduce wages in the developing world. And 3rd, I'm going to prove why this specifically helps the poorest workers we care about the most. Before positive matter, a little bit of setup, the modeling. There's 3 things that are important for the model. 1, I think this looks like restricting things that prevent people from moving across borders and financial regulations that are burdensome and prevent the moving of money or the moving your personal goods. Pretty straightforward. 2nd, I think that cursory checks are allowed, i.e., you can still ask for ID, you can still do cursory inspections to make sure people aren't carrying contraband, right? It isn't necessarily that the EU can just prance over, but it is going to be relatively easy, it's going to be relatively fast. 3rd, it's obviously only between stable countries, i.e., if a country in your borders at war or hostile to you, I don't think you're going to be doing this, or we have to defend that. We'll have to defend this in instances where it makes sense politically. Now, first piece of positive matter, efficiency. Right? Imagine you're a farmer and you're born in Antarctica. By the accident of birth, you're living somewhere where your labor is really, really bad. You can barely grow anything and you're really poor. Now imagine nobody will let you leave Antarctica, right? This is really, really bad for you. This applies to skilled labor too, right? Imagine you're an artist and you're born in a country where there's no money you can make as an artist, or you're a person who's really good at fixing machines, but you're born in a country that isn't industrialized, right? Switching jobs is relatively going to be hard for you because it's a waste of time, and it can be relatively hard. People tend to have talents in certain things, right? So people tend to want to be in certain fields, but often you can't do this at maximum efficiency in the country you're in, right? There's a lot of reasons why this is the case, right? There's going to be things like comparative advantage. Your country has better access to resources. You might have better supply networks for it. There might be more of a culture around this. Your country might be in a good location for exporting these goods, right? Certain areas are more efficient to do certain kinds of labor in, so you should be allowed to do labor in there, right? You're going to make more money as a farmer in somewhere fertile than somewhere infertile, right? So by having open borders, you can ensure that people are able to move to the places where their labor they want to do easily more efficient, where otherwise they're comparatively less likely to do that, because crossing the border is 1, relatively onerous, and 2, especially for medium or low skilled labor, governments are relatively unlikely to do this, right? So this means people are working in areas where their labor creates the most amount of value. This is good for 2 reasons. Number 1, it makes a bigger economy, right? So they're literally producing more amounts of things. More likely than not, I think they're moving to Western liberal democracies that tends to be low wages and economic efficiency is the highest, and these governments tend to have relatively high amounts of tax and relatively high amounts of redistribution for political reasons, i.e. they're responsive to their voters, and the poorer section of the voters usually want welfare, and higher and more educated voters tend to be relatively altruistic, right? There tend to be relatively strong social welfare nets, at least comparatively. So at the point they're making more money, it's also being distributed to other people, which we think is good in and of itself. But second is remittances, right? If you're being paid a higher wage, you can use some of the money in the country. You also send it to your family back home, where it necessarily immigrated, right? So it's being sent to your family, which is good for them, right? So you're helping not just one person who immigrates, but the people around them. But also, there's a preempt to any sort of brain drain argument, i.e. the smartest people all leave the country. The preempt to this is when you're sending money back, it increases the value of your currency at home because you're trading the currency, which increases demand for the currency, which means the currency is more valuable. So people at home can buy more things for relatively cheaper, so it helps them back home. And second, derives consumption back home, i.e. you send more dollars back home, now your family can spend twice as much money as they had before if they were in, say, rural India, which they're buying more things, which creates jobs in, say, rural India, which is good for the people there directly, right? I think it substantially outweighs brain drain because the most skilled labor is probably leaving countries in both worlds. Now, second argument, this starts colonial labor arbitrage. So what's the issue? Labor is unfairly worthless because of borders, right? It's hard to move your goods across borders. It's hard to move you across borders if your consumers are physically far away from you. If your and there's, like, say, restrictive trade deals, for example, because a lot of West Africa's in strong debt to France, so France can force restrictive trade deals, right? All of these things mean that the border itself and the history of a wage differential, doing the exact same thing with the same factories, with the same ability to sell, on the US side of the border and the Mexican side of the border literally give you different wages, right? I think this is bad because the higher wages go to people who historically are better off, and the lower wages go to people who are historically worse off as a direct result of colonialism, right? Doing open borders substantially solves this because it's easier to move across the border. So say things like the different pricing of labor in different countries is less likely to happen because you can just move across the border to get the higher wage, which means over time these wages are likely to even out. Why is this good? One, it helps people, right? This means workers in developing countries are getting higher wages, which I think is good. But second, I think we owe this on principle because these labor differences were gained unfairly through colonialism. The analogy here is if you steal, steal someone's car, even if it's good for you to have that car, you still should return it because it's unfair that you have that car, right? So on principle, I think we also owe it to the developing world to solve this unfair labor differential. Before I go on, I'll take a POI from CO.
So what do you think are going to be the political rights of people who go to other places now?
I think that it's going to be relatively likely they're at least given basic things like labor rights, right? I think if they're fully abused, it's going to look bad. And also because it's open borders, it checks the worst abuse in the status quo. I.e. in Qatar, you're able to do labor abuses because they take your passport and you cannot leave. And with open borders, you're just going to be able to leave without your passport, which means in your world, people can be locked into countries, which allows horrible labor abuses. But in our world, it is structurally impossible because you always have the ability to leave, right? So I think rights will always be at a bare minimum better in our world. Now, they might say this hurts wages or jobs in Western liberal democracies, but two answers to this. One, I think skilled labor is fine in either world, right? They have relatively high wages, they have high savings, they can afford to look for a job for a while. But second, I think the low-skilled labor in Western liberal democracies is better off than the developing world, right? They have better living conditions and they have better access to welfare. And even that welfare is bad or imperfect, it's better than the developing world in most cases. So they're more likely to be better off. They probably also have family they can lean on. But also I think it's unlikely it hurts labor in Western liberal democracies. Why? One, I think that labor is already going to be mostly outsourced when possible, especially low-skilled labor for the things like, say, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So I don't think this is going to matter. Second, I think that when you increase the population and have new people in your country, they're going to be buying things which induces demand, which creates new jobs, right? And natives tend to get higher paying jobs due to things like already knowing the language. So this helps natives. But third, I think the government's likely to respond with redistributive policies. A lot of people are unemployed. I think the government's likely to increase welfare. It's the response of the voters because, they want to get reelected, which probably solves the harm anyways. And the final piece of framing is I think that even if this hurts people in Western liberal democracies, that's fine, right? There are one, more people in the developing world, and two, when you're poor, the marginal utility of dollars is higher. When you have no dollars, 2,000 is a lot. When you have 100,000, $2,000 isn't that much. Proud to propose.
I thank the Prime Minister for that speech. Maybe half the leader of opposition make a case for the opening up.
Awesome. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep, all good.
Awesome. I know my camera might be a little bit laggy. I'm sorry about that. If I do freeze, just let me know in the chat. For POI preference, please use the raise hand feature on Zoom or type in POI and then your team in the chat. I'll try to get to it if I can. All right. In that case, my time will begin now. All right, so in large part, I agree with the characterization coming out of Gov, right, particularly about open borders. However, we also have to address that, simply put, this is a worldwide motion. A lot of the stuff that we're going to be seeing is not even remotely related to the US. Many countries have currently high unemployment, are much more discriminatory in nature, culturally, and also have vastly different cultures that create unique issues for immigrants in whatever places may be, right? Again, we also have to address that stakeholders. Stakeholders are the nations themselves and the people who live in them. Obviously, particularly people immigrating from one nation to another, we have to take account of the nation they're leaving and the nation they're going to. For open borders, we pretty much agree with the definition. I'm going to address this in a two-part approach, two pieces of positive matter. Firstly, we're going to look at the effects of what happens when they leave the country, and then we're going to look at the effects of what happens when someone goes to another country, right? Because that's the two countries that are biggest impacted by any one immigrant, right? Are the country they're leaving and the country they're going to. Firstly, before I begin the positive matter, I want to address one thing. Here, we agree that there might be a small amount of economic efficiency, but we have to address that there is a cost to this economic inefficiency. I want to address the example they brought up of brain drain, saying how this will offset brain drain. sure, the country might experience slightly more economic efficiency, but at the cost of losing a huge amount of their education staff, like academics, and also doctors. You can't make up for certified medical professionals with a little bit of money, right? And the definition of brain drain is that the people who perhaps are, at these positions, right? People who go into medical school, particularly in other countries where medical school is of a higher quality, you're going to be losing these individuals. All right, now onto our first piece of positive matter, which is the detriment to struggling nations, right? This is a worldwide motion, which means that you're going to see countless countries open up far more than they currently have. They mentioned this will happen relatively fast. That's a bad thing for reasons that I'll get into later, right? This means that for anyone in a struggling country, note who can afford to leave that country, who has the means and resources to get out of that country, they will, right? However, what we have to talk about is these, for a good portion of people who can just afford to go to another country, right? These aren't the people we're most worried about. We're worried that people working on the margin, people who don't have enough to eat, the people who are suffering from critically unfair wages, right? The people who are simply at the lowest possible class in their country, right? These are the people we're trying to defend. Now, why is this bad for them? Because people who can afford to leave will leave for better jobs, to escape poverty, or to escape a bad political structure. That's good for them, but it's hugely detrimental to the country they're leaving. Why is this the case? That's because these nations will suddenly see a huge exodus of people going to countries that have suddenly opened up far more, right? That's what government describes. However, what they fail to mention is that plenty of people, in fact, the majority of people who we're most worried about can't afford to leave these countries, right? Maybe if it's for their family, they're not able to get their family out of these countries, right? Or for another reason, maybe they simply can't afford to take everything they have and move to a place on the other side of the globe simply for a better wage, right? A better wage they're not even guaranteed to find a job in perhaps the first year, right? Simply put, these nations will experience huge economic collapse. And the people who are most hurt are the people who are still in those nations, the people who can't afford to leave. This means that what you're going to see is the middle class will find a significantly better life somewhere else, where the lower class, the people who aren't able to help themselves and support themselves, I can't take a POI right now, will actually see their lives significantly worsen as their nation struggles to keep hold of anyone who might perhaps consider the economy, right? Simply to mechanize this, in the US alone, a country that deals with this problem especially well, 1% increase in unemployment leads to 40,000 additional people dying that year. In these countries, you're going to see something far worse. You're going to see that as plenty of perhaps higher wage to middle wage jobs start leaving, right? Everyone at a lower wage who can't afford to leave might lose their job by being outcompeted by another country with better wages, right? They say, oh, well, countries, these wages will start to even out, right? As borders become more open. We argue, sure, these wages might begin to even out, right? But plenty of countries can't afford to continue certain things like that, which means the people working at this, say, lowest margin, right, will suddenly lose their jobs. Or these are the people who don't have the resources to get back on their feet to move to somewhere else, right? These are the people that are going to be hurt the most. Now we're going to look at what happens to the country they move to, right? And we're going to use the example of France. In France, they had a huge increase, right, of Moroccan immigration, similar to what you'd see, right, in this particular instance, a huge increase of immigration suddenly that comes by fast, right? This isn't a gradual increase, right? They even said in their speech it would happen relatively fast. What does this mean? Well, immediately after that immigration happened, right? Every time that France and Morocco played soccer matches against each other, there were riots in the streets and huge increases in cultural and ethnic tensions between the two groups. What you saw is that from something as simple as a game of soccer, there were huge riots that led to tangible increases in violence and cultural tensions, right? You're going to see something far more extreme than this if you allow this to happen, right? Say that someone's in a neighboring country, right? And they decide to move to France as the border has opened, right? And there's a huge increase like this. This group isn't going to become as assimilated as they normally would be. Instead, what you're going to see is hyper-condensed pockets of these immigrants that lead to increased tension. A gradual increase in immigration, right? A gradual increase in the population of any immigrant group in a country, these two benefit. However, what you're going to see is that with this relatively fast sudden switch and opening up the world, you're going to create huge political divides and tension issues. I'll take the POI from opening.
In developing countries, wages are generally low because there's too high of a labor supply. When people leave, the labor supply goes down, causing higher wages, helping the people who stay in those countries.
Yes, well, you're saying that what's going to happen is when these people leave, you're going to see higher wages. What I'm saying is that when these people leave, right, when you use this labor supply, you may see higher wages. And if the companies can't afford to continue using, say, this labor, they'll go to a different country, which means that every single person that you just said who needs help in that country suddenly loses their job. These are also the people who don't have the resources to perhaps make it through a prolonged period of unemployment, will not only lose their jobs, may lose their lives and be unable to feed their family. Let's say that they're a medical professional and they need to make money. So they decide to go to a different country. When they go to this different country, the country they left, which is a medical professional, the country that they're now sending money to is basically on a lifeline of people from these other countries trying to send in money, right? And at the cost of slight economic efficiency, you suddenly rob the country of its doctors. This is pretty self-explanatorily a bad thing. Listen, some immigration, right, a relatively normal amount of immigration, what we have in the status quo, leads to the opportunity of assimilation and bettering the culture of the country that you move into and the country that you're from. It allows for the spread of culture, something which I think we can agree is a good thing. The difference is that when you have this mass exodus from certain countries, the people who are left, who can't afford to leave, suddenly experience a collapsing economy and a collapsing nation. These are the people we need to watch out for the most, and the people that the government hurts the most. The government even mentions that crossing the border, that the people who are crossing the border, right, are the people for like medium to unskilled labor, right? These are people who are most likely to be crossing. Note, these are also the people who are the least able to cross, the people who have the least resources to get across. Simply put, what the government promises you is economic efficiency. But simply put, this is not what you will find. What you'll find is that certain nations collapse with the poor and the people who are unable to leave stuck in them, while other nations get all the medical professionals, academics from that region, and basically leave the other nation to rot. Thank you.
Thank the Leader of Opposition for that speech. May we now have the Deputy Prime Minister close the opening of the case.
So I know we're already recording this, but I'm gonna record myself. If anyone has a problem with that, please let me know.
I think you should be good.
Okay. Our world is in crisis. By lottery of birth, some people are born into poverty, whether that's working for 10 cents a day in a factory town in Vietnam, living under the threat of constant gang violence in Central America, or experiencing war in the Middle East. I think these people daily, on the scale of thousands, risk their lives to enter wealthier countries, for example, entering the United States, entering the European Union, and even in some cases entering middle-income countries like China. They risk death by dehydration, by boats capsizing, by scammers selling them literally into slavery, by delivering them to the wrong location. And even upon arrival, these people are often turned away because the United Nations does not recognize economic asylum. And even when they do meet the criteria for asylum, documentation can be impossible to produce. And even with documentation, the process often takes years, years in which they cannot work, years in which they cannot provide for their family, years in which basic human dignity is stripped from them, their children are taken away from them, and their families are torn apart. I think this beats back a lot of the opening opposition case because their case relies on the idea that people who are poor can't afford to move between countries. But the problem is that being the status quo in the existing world, even the people who are in the most desperate situations still find a way to be able to live, still find a way to be able to find a better life for themselves and their families, which means that they are still moving between countries. Okay, onto the opening opposition case proper. First to say, there are issues for immigrants who are going to face discrimination in the countries that they arrive in. The problem is that this is probably already exists in the status quo and it is already very bad in the status quo. I think we only have a chance of making it better because, well, if the situation is really bad in the country they're going to, they won't go to that country. That situation is going to be worse for them than the country they're already living in. The problem is agency. If you are able to choose where you want to live in, then you can choose the way as to whether you want to live in a place where there might be more discrimination or a place where you have lower wages, right? You cannot choose for them which is more efficient for them. It's the individual which gets to choose, which means we fundamentally allow these people more agency to choose what is best for their own lives, which maximizes their quality of life. But I also think that when you have more economic dependence between countries, this simply means that there's more political lines between the countries because their economies are intertwined, which means that these countries are less likely to have like as much discrimination between them because there's more people in the countries going to these places. It's simply the concept of exposing people to people who have different backgrounds, meaning that over time there becomes less discrimination, right? When you have a legal system which fundamentally oppresses the people coming from other countries, fundamentally oppresses immigrants on a legal basis, on a structural basis, that is when you have discrimination because the government is essentially endorsing that discrimination. When the government goes and does not endorse discrimination anymore by making it so these people are able to have the same legal rights as, for example, like people with green card holders in the United States, then these people are able to have less discrimination over time. Then they say that some people can't afford to leave these countries, and then a lot of people leaving countries is going to cause economic collapse and unemployment. I think the problem here is you don't understand the argument. When the countries where people are leaving are countries that are economically oversaturated. This is the reason why there are lower wages, because when there are a lot of workers, and you just need like a certain number of workers, you don't have to pay people that as much, because you pay one person $1, somebody else might be able to work for 50 cents. This is why you just pay people less and less, because there's a large number of workers, there's a large supply of work, which means that like the demand is lower than the supply. When people leave, there's going to be less unemployment because there's going to be less workers, which means that workers are able to demand higher wages. Obviously, like some things still need to happen in the developing world. Like for example, like oil production, for example, fishing still needs to occur in the South China Sea, for example, which means that there's still going to be demand for high-skilled labor, such as doctors. It just means that the people who are staying there and doing that fishing or doing that oil mining are going to have higher wages, which means they can afford to pay their doctors more, which means that more doctors are going to want to stay in the developing world because, look, they're being paid higher wages as doctors, right? This argument doesn't make a lot of sense. I'll address the brain drain argument on Gov case. Okay, then they say there's going to be backlash in like the countries that people are going to because people are very against like immigration. Answers to backlash. First of all, I think backlash already exists in the status quo, in the fact that backlash is already very bad. Most of your argumentation exists under the idea that people are like illegal immigrants, right? There's backlash because people are considered illegal in the status quo by the government. They're structurally discriminated against. When you change that structure, when you change that mindset, that's what gets rid of the backlash. But number two, I think the legal protections largely mitigate the backlash that occurs, right? Because the kind of discrimination that does occur in the developed world, where people tend to move to, is like discrimination that occurs, for example, in the workplace, because you don't have any legal protections. You can't sue your worker for workplace violations. You can't even, for example, if someone does commit a hate crime against you, you can't even sue that person. You can't even go to the police because you are worried about getting deported. But when you have legal protections to be able to like go to the police and get legal help, that actually mitigates backlash, because now people can't just do anything to you without you being able to have legal recourse for that. And thirdly, I think that in the long term, there's going to be assimilation and acceptance, right? Because just because backlash occurs does not mean that what's happening is bad. As an example, for example, ending apartheid in South Africa caused a significant amount of backlash and caused a lot of political issues, right? But that doesn't mean that ending apartheid in South Africa was a bad thing. Ultimately, in the long term, people like got over the backlash, and there was more assimilation in the long term. And even if there was backlash in the short term, even that backlash occurs for a very long time, does not mean that ending an ultimately discriminatory process is a bad thing. Number four, I think that less borders ultimately just leads to more economic dependence. What does this mean? This means that people just generally have a more resilient economy because, well, your economy is larger because you have multiple countries, you have more people in it, you have multiple like fisheries, for example. So if one fishery goes bankrupt, then you can still have fish in your economy. But I think what's more important is that there's less political conflict, because when your economy is independent on a neighboring country's economy, this means that you're less likely to have conflict with that country. And I think a lot of discrimination actually arises out of politicians having inflammatory language and using people as scapegoats, at the point where you can't use other countries as scapegoats because you're economically dependent on that country. And if you do like mess up your relationship with that country, you're gonna have really bad economic impacts in your own country. This means that the politicians are going to be acting against those immigrants, and they're not going to be increasing discrimination. I'll take actually, does closing have a POI? No, I'll take it later. Okay, moving on to the on case. First of all, on the model, I think it's really clear here that people are probably just going to be treated like permanent residents, probably going to be path to citizenship, pretty much similar to the green card system in the status quo. You can still check for contraband, or like check for like people bringing, I don't know, rotten apples into the country, right? So because you don't want your agriculture to be messed up. On economic efficiency, I think there's a multitude of impacts here, right? I think that ultimately this creates more goods because you're able to create, for example, if you're a farmer living in a place where it's economically inefficient to do farming, you can move somewhere where it's more economically efficient to do farming, and so you can create more goods through your farming, lowering the price of necessary goods, for example, food, which means people are able to afford food are more likely to be able to afford food, and also lowers their chance of an economic shock due to being able to have redundancy. For example, if you have more farmers creating at the like max economic efficiency of farming, you're having more food, which means you have more redundancy, which means that you're less likely to be able to fail to a famine, for example. On this response of losing educated workers due to brain drain, I think I have three responses here. First of all, brain drain already occurs in the status quo. For example, your own example of how doctors need to go to medical school in the developed world is the same reason why doctors tend to leave the developing world anyways. But secondly, I think it is inefficient for people to operate in the developing world, which means that even if you are a doctor operating in the developing world, you're less likely to be able to save more people because you don't have access to those resources. Whereas if you are a doctor who gets that education in the developing world and then you go back in the developed world and then you go back to the developing world, for example, or even if you do continue to operate in the developed world, you're more likely to be able to save more people because they have access to the tools to actually be able to be a doctor. I think a lot of people just tend to have cultural ties to and want to give back to their countries anyways, which means they tend to go back. And then, oh, sorry, this is I thought it was an 8-minute speech.
No worries. I thank the DPM for that speech. Maybe now have the DLO close out the top half.
Alrighty. For POIs, you can go ahead and just do the raise hand feature or give it in the chat. I have my chat open on the side right now. And my time will start No. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and start with some extraneous rebuttal. Then I'm going to extend my partner's 2 pieces of positive matter. And finally, if time permits, I'll go ahead and do a thorough comparison of worlds. All right, so just to get straight into rebuttal here, the first piece of rebuttal that I want to just go ahead and address is essentially a little bit of the model itself. So I agree fully with the first 2 pieces, right? That we're going to reduce financial barriers and that we're still going to be asking for ID, can't bring contraband, etc. The one issue with their third piece, they say that only countries with stable conditions will be taking immigrants, right? The issue with this is I think their definition of stable conditions is overly broad, right? I agree that countries that are actively at war are not going to be letting in immigrants, right? However, if we restrict the definition of stability to countries that do not have the same labor supply or the same labor oversupply problems as the countries that people are emigrating from, we're essentially restricting it to a very small subset of developed countries in this world. I do not think that is in the spirit of this motion. I think this is a global motion. Therefore, we can still see that there's going to be significant economic and cultural instabilities in the countries that this motion is saying will be taking more immigrants. And that feeds directly into our positive matter about how this has impacts on the immigrating countries, the countries that people are immigrating to, as well as the countries that people are emigrating from. To get onto my rebuttal of their first piece of positive matter about efficiency, the first example that they use is about Antarctica, right? Now, I understand that they do this to make sure that they're able to isolate the impacts, but I do want to point out a variety of ways in which this does not correspond with the modern world, right? They talk about how if you're in a country such as Antarctica, where you do not have access to fertile land, for example, right? You're able to move to another country that has more fertile land, therefore better able to put your skills to use, pretty much laissez-faire economy, right? The issue with this is quite a few, right? One is that we already addressed this a lot with brain drain. Your country needs you, right? They don't consider the effect on Antarctica at all, right? Now, the reason that this is not exactly the same as brain drain is because this applies to any job, right? This applies to farmers, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I'll get into their argument about labor oversupply in a second, but just to continue on to the reasons why this Antarctica analogy is flawed. Essentially, this is efficiency at the cost of destroying a large portion of the world. Now, what do I mean by this? They are effectively saying that anywhere that does not have fertile land, anywhere that does not have ports, anywhere that does not have the academic infrastructure in order to allow you to do your job to the fullest extent is a place that is worth leaving, right? Now, what does that mean? Well, we're not suddenly going to create fertile farmland. We're not suddenly going to create ports. We're not suddenly going to create the best colleges in the world in these countries, right? Everyone who has the ability to is going to leave. Therefore, we may have incredibly efficient developed countries in the world, but what about the other half of the world where their economy is crumbling, their political structure is crumbling, and they no longer have any sort of socio-cultural stability because half of the fathers are going to be separated from their families, right? Which, as I will mention, is one of the largest predictors of crime, one of the largest predictors of poverty. Additionally, we see that there are too many people in this world for all the farmers to get good land. So even if we say that the distribution somehow ends up working out, we cannot buy their argument that everyone is going to be placed in the perfectly efficient spot, right? Additionally, they try to preempt brain drain by saying that people who move will send back money to their family at home. At the point at which they have enough money to be able to do this on a consistent basis, oftentimes they'll choose to bring their family to this country because of the fact that it has a better living situation. So we can see that this basically leaving of the underdeveloped countries is just going to exacerbate over time. Now, getting onto their second piece of positive matter about colonial labor, they say that open borders will even out wages, right? Now, there is a reason in the status quo that borders even exist, right? It's not like if we open borders, suddenly there's going to be one perfect world market in which anyone in any country is going to get the same amount of labor or the same amount of wage for the job that they are doing, right? What we see is that countries with better infrastructure, such as academia, such as, you know, even like machinery to drill holes, or such as service economies, will still be doing most of the hiring. The countries that are sending away their other individuals to these countries are not going to be benefiting from more jobs. And as I mentioned, there is a labor oversupply in these countries, right? Now, the third piece of positive matter is that we are helping poor people, right? They say that the issue in developing countries is too large of a labor force. So when people leave these countries, the people who remain will get paid more. 2 pieces of rebuttal to this. The first one goes directly in hand with my rebuttal to their model, which is the fact that the countries they're going to are not per se developed, right? They're just slightly better. For example, if you are leaving Afghanistan because of the tenuous political situation in that country and you're being persecuted, you may go to another Middle Eastern country that does not in any way have a stable economy, that does not in any way have a bunch of job openings, right? Most of the countries in the world suffer from unemployment. We are essentially just going to be making it worse for the countries you are moving to. So if anything, this is a wash, making it better in one country, making it worse in the other country. Additionally, what we can see is that we need to consider the long-term impacts on the infrastructure and incentives for the countries themselves, right? And I'm going to get more into this for the countries that people are immigrating to, but for the countries that people are immigrating from, it does not create an incentive for these countries to create new jobs, right? If everyone is leaving, there's no need to improve your infrastructure infrastructure for farming per se, because you can essentially just get all of your stuff from other countries. There's no need to improve your own infrastructure for jobs such as doctors and lawyers, as my partner mentioned earlier, because you now have enough jobs for everyone because people are leaving. Yes, I'll take your POI.
When developing countries have high wages and lower costs of goods, I mean, people have more money to spend on things like services or making new infrastructure, which is good for the countries and makes doctors more likely to stay because the countries are better.
So that may be true if we have this gradual movement of people from developing countries to developed countries. However, what we can see is in a house where this world prefers open borders, we are going to see a mass migration of people from one country to another. And whenever we see this sort of thing, when we see this in technology, when we see this in politics, any major shift at one moment is not going to allow for these structural changes that are driven by a free market, because the free market is not able to respond that quickly. Now, getting on to the positive matter and the rebuttal that was addressed by their second speaker, they say that they rebut our argument about discrimination by saying that it is already bad in the status quo and that we will make it better in the world of the government, right? Because people can choose where they want to immigrate to. However, as is the case with the economy, as is the case with these developing countries, they neglect the macro effects. The country that these people are immigrating to will become more nationalist and more discriminatory. Sorry, I cannot take your POI. Let's look at a few examples from the past. When we had the potato famine in Ireland, suddenly a bunch of Irish people immigrated to the US, and we saw a dramatic increase in United States racism and nationalism toward Irish people. When we saw similar things happen in Asia, the US literally placed quotas on the number of Asians that could immigrate to their countries, right? So what we see is over and over again, when a bunch of people start immigrating, yes, maybe they choose to go here because at first the accepting country is not racist toward them, but eventually people in the accepting country do not like change and they will discriminate against them, making the world situation significantly worse, right? Now, going on to extend my partner's positive matter here. So our first piece of positive matter was about immigration, right? There are two pieces that I would like to extend here. So my partner talks a lot about the issues of immigration on the economic situation of the country, on the academic situation of the country. I would like to also address the political and sociocultural implications. The political implications are that when people leave from persecution, right, with the example that I mentioned in Afghanistan earlier, with the examples that we see in Russia, the examples that we see in China, et cetera, when people leave due to persecution, then there is no one left in this country to vote in a new government. This essentially undermines the function of democracy. If everyone who does not like the government is leaving, then everyone who stays are the people who either cannot afford to leave or the people who are in support of the government. Therefore, we're not going to see structural change in these countries. From a sociocultural perspective, as I mentioned earlier, the more separated families that we have, the more fathers who leave to go pursue these jobs in medicine in other countries, the more families are going to be left behind. And what we see is that absent fathers is one of the greatest predictors of crime, one of the greatest predictors of poverty in this world. So we're going to see that crime and poverty are going to increase in these countries, which is already a large problem in countries that people want to leave in the first place, therefore causing a negative feedback loop of oppression and discrimination. Thank you.
And then the speaker that speech. That also ends the top half debate. Now to kick off the back half debate, may we have the member of God.
Yeah, give me like 30 seconds to get my stuff ready.
Yep, sure.
Can you see me? Yes, you can. You can hear me, right?
Yes, all good.
Cool. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. All right, two critical issues with top half that is going to make it super simple for CG to take it and CO to take it if they're not going to be stupid in this round. I think two things here. One, who does open borders affect? We have literally not talked about who can now immigrate once we have this policy, what the delta is. Secondly, why do we want open borders? Everybody has just been debating whether immigration itself is good or bad. Nobody has been debating the unique premise of the motion that we should have completely open borders. CG is going to come in, defend both of these things, tell you why we win this round. Firstly, I think the biggest problem with top half is who does open borders affect? what changes? I think opening government and opening opposition have given you no analysis of this. I think one critical observation here that is going to literally symmetricize much of top half is that the vast majority of people are not just going to suddenly uproot their fucking lives and move to a new country once there are open borders. I think this is the case for three critical reasons. One, that immigrating is just a substantially huge barrier that a lot of people just won't want to overtake, no matter their situations. That's to say, you might need to adjust to a new language, a new job market that the skills you might have not been taught in your original country's education system to adapt to. You probably don't have a house in that country, and as such, probably need to engage in another property system that is probably very foreign to you. And you probably have a lack of community there for you to be able to go to that country and feel safe, secure, and social there. Secondly, I think people are often irrationally and non-economically tied to their home country. I think this is the case for two reasons. One, they probably have family within that country that probably does not want to go for the reasons I gave you. So whether it's their parents, whether it's their cousins, particularly in countries that have cultures of filial piety, which is the vast majority of the developing world, people don't want to leave parents, people don't want to leave family behind. I think secondly, people often have tradition or a sense of responsibility to their country that they grew up in. That's to say, they probably believe that the government or the country they grew up in has supported them, put them through education, or as such done things like that, so they probably don't want to leave. I think thirdly, just people are afraid of change. It's a very risky take, and as such, the vast majority of people probably aren't going to do it. I think even if you are poor, you're or like having a bad life in your current country, you're unlikely to want to leave because, like, just rationally, it's unlikely you're going to get a better life in another country that's more competitive, where you have less support systems. I think at that point, the vast majority of people are not going to immigrate. The vast majority of people doesn't change whether it's open borders. So who can immigrate? I think critically two people. I think rich people or well-educated people who have the capacity to take this risk, or two, people who have such bad lives who are willing to take the risk anyway. I think this is notably going to be refugee populations. I think an observation on top half now, the number of people immigrating does not substantially change when you open the borders. That means that the OOOG split is pretty much fucking like irrelevant at this point. Right? Because it's not about how many people immigrate. It's not about how many people change their country. It's about whether the open borders policy itself is good. So what changes? Two things. I think one, open borders forces all developed countries to take a fair distribution of immigrants, allowing for the increased chance of success for these immigrants, which then locks in every single impact that opening government gets in a much better way, in a much more unique way to this motion. Secondly, you sidestep political pressures to allow for more refugees. Okay, another observation, I just don't think everybody has been debating. Everybody has been debating whether immigration is good, not necessarily whether like open borders is good. This is what we're uniquely doing in closing government. I think one, how you now have the forced fair distribution of immigrants. I think right now, immigration is decided by political caps that are subject to change at the whims of a country's political desires. I think often these whims are not created by economic or pragmatic desires, but rather based on how socially progressive or socially non-progressive or xenophobic a country is. I think this is critically the case because often it's very hard for somebody to internalize or to be able to see the long-term economic implications of allowing a shit ton of new immigrants, but it's very easy to fall prey to very progressive rhetoric or very non-progressive rhetoric. I think at that point, there's a very big problem. Some countries don't take any immigrants, while other developed countries take a lot. I think this is just the case because of difference in ideology, that political pressures lead to politicians voting in certain things. I think this is so bad for two I think that this is so bad for two critical reasons. I think one, it makes succeeding as an immigrant far harder because there's often a lopsided job market that is not based on supply and demand, but is rather just based on the political whims of the country. And secondly, you are probably unsure as to whether you can stay in a country because you as an immigrant know that your immigration status is subject to the political whims of a country. Your visa could be gone if a new president or a new regime gets elected. I think comparatively, with every country having open borders, you allow supply and demand to take place, which then leads to the most efficient economic outcomes and the highest chance of success for the most immigrants. I think this is I think that the impacts is probably going to be threefold. One, I think immigrants just do better on our side of the house in every single instance. I think one, they can probably find a job in better instances. That's to say, instead of just being pigeonholed to France or like, I don't know, a progressive country, they can now like find jobs like pretty much anywhere, wherever they're open in the vast majority of the developed world. And it's not just based on the politics. That means that it's not based on the political whims, but rather where their job opportunities are the best, which allows them to have the epistemic access to decide where they live is going to be the best. I think secondly, they can probably find better paying jobs because in the status quo, you basically pigeonhole a lot of immigrants to just one area. I think comparatively on our side of the house, you allow them to spread out, which means the supply of these immigrants is significantly lower, which means they're not competing against each other, pushing their labor wages down, which means they get paid more. I think secondly, they just have more mental security in their place in the country, so they're more likely to feel happy there. I think at the point where you're scared that a political whim can literally change whether your visa is accepted in the country or whether you can stay in a country that you're trying to build a life in, you're probably one, just far less likely to be able to enjoy yourself and far more stressed in your life, and two, far less likely to actually invest in building a good life in that country. So you're probably going like half and half investments in both countries. Okay, and I think secondly, you probably just have less xenophobia, because when it's subject to like supply and demand, that means that it's filling the demand within a country, which means that you're probably not going to see like a massive taking of jobs of like people within that country. So it's far harder to blame immigrants. Okay, I think at that point, just immigrants have better lives on our side. I think uniquely this already takes out top half, because we told you uniquely why open borders is good, not just why immigration is good, and why for the unique stakeholder that this is going to impact, which is people who probably already can immigrate, they just get better lives. But I think secondly and critically here, another extension is just that refugees can just get accepted in more countries. And I'm just shocked nobody has said this. I think right now they're just probably pushback to refugees for two reasons. One, I think people within a host country probably are just xenophobic in some instances, and two, they are probably fearful of refugees leeching off of welfare systems. I think that leads to people not allowing a lot of refugees who probably don't have a lot of good life life circumstances. I think comparatively open borders means that you get more refugees. And I think that means that the impact is extraordinarily simple. Even if their life is not perfect on like in the comparative side of the world, at least we're allowing people who are struggling a lot to now get accepted in more countries. Okay, very proud to take the win from closing government.
I thank the speaker for that speech. May we have the member of
Hi, can you hear me well?
Yep, your audible.
Cool. I'll take POIs in the chat. So definitely try to engage with at least one of the teams. Cool. Starting my speech into 3, 2, 1. Panel, because there's no info slide, none of the teams has actually characterized in this round what open borders means. I think that we have to start off with a minimalist conception. That this means that like, oh, you can enter the country, have some labor standards, some protections, but none of the sides like characterize what they're going to be and what happens when those are taken away due to several reasons. Firstly, I'm going to engage with the political characterization of the states that are going to be net recipients of refugees or new immigrants. And secondly, I'm going to explain this, like why this results in massive global inequalities and a global apartheid to like a level unseen before. Let's deal with CG. Firstly, they talk about like, oh, the delta in this debate is not that hard. I think that they just do a lot of like not really knifing, but they just mitigate a lot of like OG's benefits in their own case, right? Like it means that some of the like literally the smallest like layer of the most privileged people are going to be better at like saving their assets in the West, I guess. Like I don't know. But secondly, even if we take the supply demand analysis that they give, firstly, a lot of the immigrants just don't have the perfect information of where to go, right? Because a lot of this like immigration decisions are based on like previous conceptions of where it is best to be, right? Like people went to America because it was the promised land, and a lot of them ended up very poor and currently live in one of the most unequal economies in the world, right? But secondly, I think that like still they don't analyze that the political incentives still persist to regulate the supply and demand, or like how many rights do you give to individuals. And we're going to show you why it balances out that most states are going to choose in the West to simply pull back the welfare state, pull back any benefits they give to like immigrants who don't have the right to vote. So firstly, on the whole like political characterization of the net recipients in this debate. So I have 4 characterizations. Firstly, nobody gives you a right to vote, like note panel, right? Probably this is going to be something like the European Union, where you can come in, like kind of work, you have a residential permit, right? But like obviously this debate is not like, oh, if you cross the border, you get a passport and you go and elect a national government, right? It's probably like doesn't work. Why? Because of like historical reasons of nationalism, of cultural identity. You're not willing to just give away all the political rights. And I think it's reasonable to assume that open borders just means the more minimalist conception as a starting point. And they have to prove why people would be able to vote and affect decisions that would in turn like represent them and benefit them. Secondly, a lot of the buy-in to the welfare state and like labor rights are predicated on this, right? Like who votes for them, right? Because like if you are like realize that like a lot of the people that are just coming in are getting your benefits or your tax money without necessarily like having the live there, etc., etc., you're just going to pull that away, right? Like Italy does this when immigrants come in, like in the specific provinces where their populations are higher, the welfare state is just lower, or like OG talks about, oh, at least you're going to get some like legal representation. Like in a lot of these scenarios, like in Qatar or like even the US, like the police literally shoots immigrants that they don't like based on their color, right? Like this is like insane to claim that all these people are going to be like sort of live the same prosperous life that they want to characterize. Thirdly, why contact theory doesn't work in like way, why the assimilation of culture is not that rosy after all, right? Like CG like sort of like mitigates this benefit by saying, oh, there are going to be so few people anyways. So I think that like this knives like OG because it means that like more people like there are going to be fewer immigrants in. So the prejudice against them is going to be more severe, right? Because contact theory that can't work. Like people are not going to see them as the norm anyways, right? Also, like for you to have contact theory and integration to work, you have to like exclude some preconceived notions. Like a lot of people are racist, a lot of people are xenophobic, and like when the populists come up in the political campaigns are saying, oh, they're coming for your jobs, oh, they're taking away your wages. It doesn't actually sometimes matter if the economic argument is wrong or right. It's about how the population perceives this. We have seen this like with a lot of like populist governments in Europe, like places like Germany have AfD now after like accepting a lot of immigrants as like the third most popular party, right? Like read The Economist this week. So essentially, and the other reason is that like you have a perceived like competition zero sum for resources. Why? Because like things like climate change are going to mean that like, oh, you have more polluted cities, like worse off air. The thing that like wages are going to probably decline in a lot of these areas where people are going to see the most like opportunities, but also like language and cultural differences that CG also characterizes. Fourthly, there's a toxic narrative of cultural dominance because now you're going to see some of the states as being more prosperous, ones that like everyone immigrates to, and therefore that local population can leverage that narrative of saying, oh, everywhere else is basically a shithole and we should not care about those people, right? This is very toxic, which leads me to my second big argument about global inequalities. I have 5 reasons here. First, note that OG also characterizes economic deregulations and opening up borders. There are 3 harms under this. Firstly, you like literally destroy the infant industries in developing countries if you deregulate them and don't allow them to use some protectionism to allow them to industrialize, right? It just looks like, you know, some like developing countries just like protecting some industries so that they're not flooded by cheap imports from the West or China, right? So in order to like, you know, increase some capital stock and develop human capital and be able to become more prosperous in the future, right? Like if you have this is very, very bad. B, a lot of land grabs and land buying is happening, for example, in the Horn of Africa, where Saudi Arabia is buying land in order to like, you know, leverage off of the potential impacts of climate change where the like crop yields are going to be reduced, right? So essentially, if you open up borders to that as well and have no capital controls and no like, you know, purchasing controls between borders, you have this like global hegemony where some states are going to control developing countries and the people who live there are not able to access capital and they're not able to actually industrialize and become better in the future. Lastly, you get like financial flows. It's harder to tax individuals like their income and their wealth if they can ship it off to other countries. It's incredibly hard to like then reach this redistribution that like OG also wanted to talk about. Before I move on, I'm going to take OG, please.
Yeah, so the 10 million people currently being held captive on the US southern border don't care about voting or economic efficiency. They just want to be let fucking go.
I don't think that refutes my argument. Sorry, but like the POI is just like much shorter and like 6 seconds than like 4 minutes of my analysis. Secondly, you're also going to less likely to invest from the West. Why? Because of like depopulation and seeing these places like lost causes. Thirdly, things like climate change. You have a lesser incentive to help those people because like the most privileged and the most like the ones with the most political capital in these states are just going to move and live like in like better off states that have better climate, like generally more healthy. Fourthly, in times of war, you're probably just going to leave as like the middle class or like the people who are able to immigrate, they're going to leave, right? Leaving some like a lot of the times the autocrats or oppressive governments in power and not like protesting against them or not like trying to overthrow them. Why is this important? Obviously, it's probably good for these individuals, right? But that leaves a lot of like minority and like vulnerable populations in places where they don't have like enough political capital, where they don't have enough economic resources to get out of autocracies, right? And the Western states are also not interested in helping these vulnerable autocratic governments such as in Africa or like, you know, Asia, right? Because like they don't perceive these places as worthwhile, right? Because like people are just moving across borders anyways, and they're gonna be like, oh, this is a failed government anyway, so just emigrate to your neighboring country. Because of all of these reasons, I think that's the other thing.
I thank the speaker for that speech. May we have the Gov Whip close the case for CG.
Is everyone ready and can hear me?
Sorry, you sound a little bit distant. Would it be
Hello.
possible to speak closer to the device?
Better?
Yeah, I think this will be fine if you speak just a little bit louder. That'll be good.
Okay, sounds good. For POIs, I prefer just raise your hand, like for the digital hand. The entire opening half fails to engage with the actual motion of whether we should have open borders and are only debating on the idea of immigration and limiting themselves in this debate. We tell you that all of their arguments fall into whether immigration is good or not without engaging with the actual idea of open borders as a whole, right? CO tries to acknowledge it, but their case also falls non-unique to it in the sense that their links are all non-unique and only applies to immigration and not uniquely to those open borders. With that being said, let me first go down the opposition bench. So first on OO, right? They give you this argument that donor countries will be worse off. First of all, that's just not true on this idea of brain drain, right? We tell you that a lot of times individuals are not to their full potential in those developing countries. Their utility or benefits of those individuals are not optimized for 4 reasons, right? Firstly, there's lack of resources and equipment to actually allow them to go to their full potential. Second of all, education, like more developed countries just generally have better and more advanced education. Third of all, this idea of congregation of talent, right? When you have more talented or skilled co-workers or like business partners, you're more likely to develop better ideas and actually reach your full potential. Fourthly, on political structures, right? We tell you that when they get to choose from an array of political structures, from an array of countries that Veer has uniquely told you that CG has opened you up to, they could like better their potential as a whole a lot more, right? We tell you that moreover, in our world, when you have open borders, there's just generally more freedom of movement in general, right? Why is this true? Imagine being an immigrant, generally in the government world, you're not going to be concerned about your work visa expiring or like if you return to your country to work for a period, you can't come back again, right? We tell you that having this more freedom of movement is a lot better because for 2 reasons, right? Firstly, generally in the government world, we have higher skill level workers. And second of all, there's just more movement and exchange. So there's going to be like, for example, if a doctor got tired of working in the developed country, they can go back to their country and like do nonprofit work for a year. And then they want to work again and they can move back to the developed country, right? We tell them all of those are really easy. Second of all, we tell you that generally they're just not really linked out, right? We tell that remittances will make those countries a lot better off in the government world. Third of all, on this idea of principle of autonomy, we tell that individuals generally should not be burdened with the entire like moral obligation of uplifting countries out of poverty, right? The burden should fall on the colonizers, not those individuals who are already victims of their systems. Second of all, the opening bench comes with this idea that those host countries would face greater social unrest, backlash. This is something that OO has touched on and CO has tried to make unique, but doesn't really work. So first of all, on this idea of xenophobic backlash, right? Firstly, that's just non-unique. It happens in both worlds. But second of all, with open borders, the norms are generally flipped, right? With the open borders, the very idea of illegal immigrants become obsolete, right? That's no longer a case or ever could be a case in the government world. We tell you that this mindset would have a huge change, and therefore this would likely mitigate this kind of backlash in the long run or xenophobia in the long run because this idea of like borders and keeping people out are already obsolete. Now they come up really OO talk really quickly about voting out bad governments. I think that's just not applicable in most cases. In a lot of developing countries, it's autocracies or hybrid regimes where they have corrupt or rigged democracies. I just don't see why this is actually the way for developing countries to actually move out of poverty. So now on CO really quick. Actually, I'll take one from OO. OO.
Yeah, okay. So your mechanism for why these people who are leaving the developing countries would choose to go back to the developing countries rather than stay in the developed country is that they get tired of working there. What we see is that in the status quo, people choose to stay in the developed countries because better living conditions. Therefore, we see a lot of brain drain.
No, so my point entirely is that because you no longer would be restricted from those developed countries, essentially you can move back and then move back to the host country again, right? We tell you that it's just a lot more freedom of movement. People will be less scared to move back and do charity work for their original country. Now on CO, right? Their first argument is essentially that the political rights of immigrants will be taken away. We tell you that their entire link is non-unique, right? Their entire link is on like racism and xenophobia, but that's just like, that would happen in both worlds, right? Whether you have more, like you have an open border or not, essentially that would happen in both worlds. Racists will find a reason no matter what to like attack those people. We tell that in our world, it could actually be better because we normalize this idea of immigration. We make the idea of illegal immigrants completely obsolete. Already touched on that. But moreover, we tell you that immigrants just generally care more about economic rights than political rights, right? Veer has already told you why that is true, right? We tell you that the reason why in the government world we can actually uniquely give you more immigrants more economic rights is threefold, right? Firstly, they have better jobs in general because the countries that they get to choose to go to and immigrate to are not just based on like being politically progressive, right? We tell that second of all, they get better paying jobs because the amount of the immigrants are more spread out to all different countries, that because all countries are essentially have to accept immigrants. And when you have more spread out immigrants, essentially there's less supply in an individual country that is congregated there, and therefore they could get higher wages, right? We tell that the two reasons make the economic rights of those immigrants a lot better. But we also tell you that essentially they get more mental security, right? They can be happier and they could like stop worrying about their work visas and actually pursue jobs that could give them everything, right? Right now, there's a huge work visa limitation imposed by most companies. We tell that essentially in the government world, they could apply to all kinds of companies without restriction, right? We tell that that is a huge benefit, and immigrants generally care more about economic rights more than political rights, because the reason why they come to those host countries is essentially to pursue a better life through economic means mostly, right? But second of all, we're going to engage with this idea of refugees too. Even if they want political asylum, we tell you that refugees get better lives in our world because there's less pushback from the status quo. We tell you that they're accepted in more countries, so they're not crowded into those countries with like very overwhelmed public service systems, right? We tell that essentially the burden of accepting refugees can be more evened out among developing countries. Next, really quickly, CEO talked about global inequality. We tell you that firstly, those countries can still have economic policies, right? They could still protect some of their infant industries. Second of all, there's just going to be more exchange of people and cultures and less hostility to fuel those policies that are like aggressive and such, right? Because of those reasons, we think the closing government, firstly, uniquely engages with this idea of open borders. And second of all, we uniquely told you why those economic rights of those individuals would be greatly expanded in the government world. Because of those reasons, so proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for that speech, and now to end this debate, maybe have the opposition.
All right, can everybody hear me well?
Yep.
All right, so I'll please just take POIs by like raising your hand using the raise hand function. If not, if you put it in chat, I'll be able to see it, but it's just easier if you raise your hand. I should be able to get to one POI during my speech. If everybody's ready, I will start in 3, 2, 1. The first thing I want to do is address CG, because the problem is that maybe they're substantively engaging with what open borders is relative to immigration, but they do so at the cost of knifing OG. So I just want to address their arguments in a really, really substantial way, because the problem is that all of their arguments are effectively mitigatory. What they're doing is they're narrowing the scope of who this applies to. They're saying that this applies to the elites only, and then a small group of refugees for whom life is the absolute worst off. Part of this is slightly problematic, but we'll give them a little bit, because I mean, to say that you have $2,500 to cross the border by paying some smuggler is already showing that you have some level of security that a lot of poor people do not have. Like the poorest of the poor in fucking Guatemala just don't have the money, like $2,500 to drop on immigrating to a new country. So give it a little bit of caution in that claim, but even let's say that, given the benefit of the doubt, even there, it's pretty problematic because we've shown that these groups are not going to be accepted by mainstream societies in Western developed countries. There's just a lack of engagement on the reasons we're saying that the normalization that they say will happen it just won't happen, because we've already shown that contact theory doesn't work. You know, there was reasons that came from OO that weren't properly recognized, but basically talking about that, like when you have a large influx of people into a specific country, that does create substantial resentment because the rhetoric is they're taking our jobs. We characterize it on the basis of perception with an extremely unique level of argumentation and mechanization that was not provided in OO, because we analyze the fact that, look, part of the problem is not because of economic benefits. Germany actually does benefit as a result of immigration because it's fulfilling a labor population that doesn't exist there. However, it matters the way that political parties weaponize this through rhetoric, and that's the type of characterization that only comes out of CICO. People prefer our mechanization on it. Secondly, they talk about how like people are going to see increased wages. This is the same line of argumentation that we get from OG, but the problem with it is that it's really going to be a race to the bottom. If you have a whole new population of laborers that are used to working for wages that are significantly lower, and now they're going to compete with American workers, it's going to be a race to the bottom to see who can handle the lowest regulation, the lowest wages. And also, more to our point, which was never addressed by CG, there's going to be a race to the bottom in terms of regulations. We talked previously in this debate between especially the opening half about keeping people in nascent industries or essential industries within their native countries. Specifically, the conversation was on doctors. However, the problem is that we just don't have the funds available to like pay doctors in like developing countries when they know that they can make significantly more money extorting the hell out of the millionaires in like Greenwich, Connecticut. Right? If I know that I can make millions and millions and millions of dollars by charging rich people insane amounts of money because that's where they live, then I'm going to abandon Poland no matter how much the hospital is willing to pay for me there. And investors who are going to fund my hospital are not going to build a hospital in Poland. Therefore, all of those places go to absolute shit. And the additional problem there is that those countries become areas of absolute pensioners. Because when I have remittances, which is the strategy constantly advocated by both OG and CG, I cannot sustain an economy. What is the reasoning behind this? Remittances are predicated on the idea that adults are moving from their country to another more developed country to pursue economic opportunity. When they do this, the problem is that they are now having their kids in that country. They're becoming citizens of that country through arguments like jus soli, you're born on that soil, your child is born to that country as a citizen of that country. That's how they eventually long-term get political rights, but those existing political rights are denied at the first level. But I'll get to that later. The primary issue with that is that eventually you're experiencing cultural genocide as nobody is being born in countries like Poland, Eastern Europe, and nobody's being born in like sub-Saharan African countries because they recognize, look, if I move to the West, I can have my child born there. They can have numerous economic opportunities. They can experience the academic benefits. And you start slowly seeing the creation of a center and a periphery on global politics, a global market. In this way, we feel that OO is incapable of engaging with the proper world market characterization. They resisted OG's characterization. Actually, OG's characterization was relatively accurate. People will compete. The problem with OG's characterization is they say magically, oh, Mexican workers are not going to settle for any single wage except for the one provided by the US. That's just not true. They're used to living on lower wages. They'll continue to fight for lower wages. And then capitalists will get the enjoyment out of being price setters. That's the nature that is of the economic system, which has been completely ignored by all sides of the debate up until now. My lights are going out. Up until now, there's been a complete problem of price setters are being the firms, and we're pretending that wage earners are the ones who get to bargain for absolutely whatever wage that they want. And this is just not the characterization which actually flows through the round. I want to address the specific points that CG says that they bring uniquely to the table. They talk about specifically how they they create mental security with no threats of deportation. But we've already shown that this is not a possibility, especially when you're relying on people like the police and the judicial system to help enforce your rights. The judicial system didn't enforce the rights of Qatari workers or like non-Qatari workers who were working in Qatar to have their passports, even though that was a violation of several laws. They did not. The police are not adequate protectors of refugees and asylum seekers. They just aren't that effective, especially when there's a large amount of resentment. So if we cannot face the backlash issue and substantively combat it, then we are not going to be able to create substantive change. Can I get the POI?
Yeah, so price setters in the United States and other developed countries are overpaying for labor, a cost that is passed on to the consumer. A Mexican farmer in the United States is still going to make more for farming in the United States than they would have made in Mexico.
The reason that they're overpaying, according to what you're saying, it's not really overpaying if laborers are able to demand it because they're in such small populations. But what you're saying is increase the population to the scale of the world. When the whole world's population is competing for the same wages, guess what? Wages are going to drop because it's just a competition of saying who's going to accept being paid the least. And that's the engagement that's not happening from either OG or CG. And so therefore, like full econ just flows completely to CO. I want to also talk about some of the other arguments that they talked about with mental security. I already addressed mental security. They talk about people having communities at home. Basically, like, yeah, you've got systems of capitalism which encourage people like, hey, we got a nice fancy job at McKinsey in New York here for you. Come over to my place. Like, look, they're going to have to abandon those communities. Communities die. Families fall apart. It reduces overall wealth, happiness, and mental satisfaction. People are going to be really sad. So, like, I think the CG impact actually turns. When you look at arguments that come from OG, I mean, like, look, their whole thing is on econ. Their econ arguments pretty much fail because also, like, firms invest where they think that they're going to get money when people are going to, they know that people are going to pay the most. Therefore, places where people can't pay the most are immediately lose all the competition. Countries can't pay competitive doctors' wages, all that stuff. Also, like, issues about political willpower do matter a lot, and that was something that went completely unaddressed from our side of the house. We talk about how things like political rights and political access to political goods are like absolutely necessary. And one of the ways that we talk about this is like unemployment insurance and other sort of automatic stabilizers. the reality is once you have open border systems, companies and multinational corporations are going to start getting really, really involved all across the world. And when they start doing that, you're going to see massive impacts if, like, for example, there's financial instability in one country. The useful thing in the system is that usually we have things like unemployment insurance, which help like balance things out, but those are really impossible to allocate when you realize that, look, like our population is not a set population. People are moving in and out of the country. Open borders creates that unique problem. So if we're going to use CG's characterization, we're not addressing open immigration, open borders, that's the real characterization. We have no ability to allocate welfare benefits, and so it's more likely going to incentivize politicians to just cut those completely. Lastly, I just want to move for one last time back to the OO case. Basically, OO just like focuses on backlash, and it's just not the most important impact when you're seeing that people's political rights lead to material violence against them in substantive ways. We're seeing that there's cultural genocide all across the world. And we're seeing that the elitist advantage means that also just like large swaths of the population is actually being negatively affected in more concrete ways than just like generally saying, oh, elitists are the only ones who benefit. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much. That's also the end of this particular debate. Could Elena